This morning, we continue our sermon series exploring the powerful and often overlooked stories of women in Scripture. Penn has already shared with us about Ruth and Sarah, two remarkable women whose faithfulness shaped the course of God's Old Testament people. Ruth, through her steadfast loyalty, became part of the lineage of King David and eventually of Jesus. Sarah, despite laughing at the news initially, embraced motherhood at an advanced age, which led her to be the matriarch of a great nation. Today we turn to another extraordinary woman, Esther, whose story blends humility with courage. Her bold actions become the salvation of the very people that Sarah helped to multiply. We will pick up the story of Esther in chapter 4, but let me encourage you to spend time with this book at home. It reads like a novel, and it's a wonderful short tale full of plot twists and turns, excellent character development, and moments of human vulnerability and strength. But in case you have other plans for the afternoon, I'll catch you up to where our story is going to begin. Imagine with me, it's about 100 years after the Babylonian exile. The Persian Empire now rules the region, and a small group of Jews are living in the capital city of Susa, displaced, marginalized, and vulnerable. Two Jewish characters emerge in this story, Esther and her kind cousin Mordecai, who has raised her because she was an orphan. We are also introduced to King Ahasuerus, who is known for his fortune and his ego, and his ambitious advisor, Haman. When the story opens, the king is holding a grand banquet for the purpose of displaying his vast wealth and power throughout the kingdom. The feast lasts 7 days, and its opulence is described in exquisite detail. The best linen on the tables, clouds of cotton flowing from marble pillars, and an endless flowing of the best wine served in golden goblets. As the final flourish, the king calls for the queen to parade before his elite guest list to display her renowned beauty. Whether insulted or afraid, the queen refuses and is banished from the kingdom as the quick-tempered king is enraged by her behavior. So remember this character trait for later. Soon a search begins for a new queen. Think of it as an ancient beauty pageant, and the most desirable women of the land are summoned, as only the best will do for Ahasuerus. Mordecai knows there is no real prospects for an orphan like Esther, and he sends her to the pageant, and the rest is history. The king is smitten, and Esther becomes the new queen. Faithful cousin Mordecai, feeling both proud and afraid for Esther, lurks around the palace gates to catch snippets of gossip as to how Esther is faring in her new role. In one of the many providential coincidences in this story, he overhears of a plot to kill the king. He sneaks to get a word to Esther. She informs the king on his behalf, and the king's life is saved. Mordecai then gets promoted into the king's service, but trouble is brewing. Haman, drunk on power, demands that all in service to the king must bow down to him, and Mordecai refuses. While Esther is hiding her Jewish identity for her safety, Mordecai proudly proclaims his Jewish faith and his loyalty to his God. Haman is furious. However, he fears the king enough not to harm Mordecai directly, so Haman begins a plot to have the king execute all of the Jews. He claims the foreigners living among them are a dangerous threat and convinces the king to have them all slaughtered on a future date determined by a roll of the dice. A decree goes out to every province in Persia that on this identified date, all the Jews are to be killed. This is where our story picks up. So I'm reading Esther chapter 4. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went through the city, wailing with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. In every province where the king's command and his decree came, there was a great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and most of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's maids and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Haddach, one of the king's eunuchs who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai and learn what was happening and why. Haddach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther, explain it to her, and charge her to go to the king to make supplication to him and to treat him for her people. Haddach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said, and then Esther spoke to Haddach and gave him a message for Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law: to be put to death. Only if the king holds out the golden scepter to someone may that person live. I myself have not been called into the king for 30 days. When they told Mordecai what Esther had said, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think that the king's palace you will escape any more than the rest of the Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise from the Jews for another place, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for such a time as this." Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, "Go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will fast as you do. After that, I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
The King
Thank you, Kelly. It's always a joy to lead worship with you. Right after graduate school, I went to work at my first real job. I had a windowed office, newly framed degrees on the wall, and an assistant outside my door. When she buzzed me and said, "Miss Crain, your first client is here," I froze. I had done the coursework to become a therapist, but I was not prepared for what I was now supposedly qualified to do. 30 years and 3 kids later, I thought I was a bit more seasoned by life and education. However, it was a similar experience of panic the first time I stepped into this pulpit 2 years ago. I had been to seminary, taught by some incredibly talented professors, and I fully trusted in the process of call. Yet I still felt completely inadequate to share a word from the Lord with all of you. The feeling I was having both of those times is what professionals now call imposter syndrome. I suspect many of us have experienced it as a freshman in college, as a first-time parent, or as an employee in a new role. By definition, imposter syndrome is a psychological experience in which a person suffers from feelings of intellectual or professional fraudulence. Although it has come to be known as common in all genders, It was first studied in the late 1970s in women in professional roles or positions of authority. I think our heroine in today's story has a fairly serious case of imposter syndrome, and with good reason. Esther is an exile, an orphan, with no grounding in family history or no sense of security. She is also a Jew, another automatic drop in status as a resident alien in the royal city of Susa. Her beauty, whether a gift or a curse, is nothing she has earned, yet it has taken her from the safety of her cousin's home and lands her in the king's harem. She catches the king's eye, and then she is the queen of Persia. It is easy to imagine how scared and out of place she must have felt. Yet while still reeling from her new position, Esther's people are suddenly in serious trouble. Her only family, her cousin Mordecai, who has taken her in, tells her she is the Jewish people's hope. Esther had been hiding her heritage and her relation to Mordecai as he was hated by the king's right-hand man, Haman. My children used to watch a VeggieTales movie of this tale. Amidst some cocky cucumbers and proud potatoes, Esther is a humble green onion who cannot imagine pleading her case on her people's behalf. Unlike in a movie released years later that you might have seen, The Princess Diaries, Esther doesn't have a queen grandmother to tutor her on royal etiquette and public speaking. No wonder her first instinct was to send the message back to her cousin Mordecai that even though she wanted to, she could not help. Esther did not have any reason to trust in her own authority and position and thought the situation was hopeless. Do y'all remember what happened to the last queen who defied the king? Mordecai pleads with Esther and asks her to consider that she was put in this particular time and place for just this very purpose. Perhaps hesitantly, or maybe with youthful wisdom, Esther reaches out to her community. She asks all the Jews in Susa to fast with her for 3 days while she prepares to appear before the king. It doesn't explicitly state this in our text, but in Jewish tradition, fasting is accompanied by continuous prayer. Esther is turning to religious customs and community to give her strength to fight for the salvation of God's people. Ironically, however, an interesting fact about the book of Esther is the only book in our Holy Scriptures that doesn't explicitly refer to God. Now, many scholars believe the writer employed a brilliant literary technique to invite readers into the story, searching for God's activity in the world. Although there is no direct reference to God, God's hand is at work all throughout the story. We read of an orphan who becomes queen, an exile who is promoted to the king's royal guard, and a powerful man who is brought low. While it may not explicitly say so, the entire book is a beautiful example of God's upside-down kingdom, where the last shall be first, and the first shall be last. So, spoiler alert, if you are planning to go home and read this story later, the king is shocked by Esther's bold appearance before him, yet her life is spared, and he intervenes to save her people. Haman is put to death, ironically on the same gallows he had built for Mordecai's execution, and Esther and King Ahasuerus live happily ever after, or sort of. You can read that part. Her bravery and prayerful preparation did exactly what was needed, and perhaps she was placed in the palace for such a time as this. I often wonder why I have found myself in this time and place and what I am called to do within it. I question if divine intervention placed me here or if it is just circumstance. I suspect many of you wonder the same. However, I'm coming to rest that I don't really need to know the answer to that question. Either way, I can do something for the work of God's kingdom. Mother Teresa has a famous quote that states, "Not all of us can do great things, but all of us can do small things with great love." Serving in the pantry will not solve our country's food insecurity crisis. Yet last week I held a baby and made him giggle while his mom shopped for her family. A language barrier prevented us from saying much more than hello, but our mutuality was communicated in that moment as mothers. Chaperoning a field trip to Ninja Nation on one of the last days of summer camp will not solve our country's educational disparities, but it might show a child living in poverty that you care about them and their future in our community. Assembling sandwiches for our unsheltered neighbors will not provide more affordable housing in our city, but it can make a difference to hungry people on a day when they are fearful for their futures. And writing letters to our elected officials may not change policy overnight, but it speaks of compassion and moral witness in the midst of possible cuts to educational and social service programs. Color your own tiny corner of the world, Mother Teresa said, and we will all have a beautiful canvas. Dorothy Count Scoggins was probably about the age of Queen Esther when she was one of only 4 Black students to attempt to integrate Charlotte public high schools following the ruling in Brown versus the Board of Education. There is a nationally award-winning photograph of Dorothy walking into Harding High School with her head held high as a crowd of nearly 300 people were yelling racial slurs. The girls in the crowd were spitting on her pretty new school dress, and the boys in the crowd were throwing rocks at her head. She held steady and marched into the school. While staff and teachers looked the other way, the harassment continued at opening assembly and throughout the rest of the day. Yet she got up the next morning and went to school again. No doubt that she or her family could have been killed for her courage. It was a horrible time in our city's history. However, nearly 60 years later, I attended a redo of that nationally famous walk down the street and up the steps of the former Harding High School, steps that are now a historic landmark at Irwin Elementary. Hundreds of people lined the streets with posters that said, "We love you, Dot. Thank you for your bravery." And as a 75-year-old woman walked slowly down the street towards the school, the crowd started shouting, "Dorothy, Dorothy." There was not a dry eye on the street that day, including mine. Our actions will not undo the trauma that she experienced as a teen, but they are a beautiful example of how God's love brings restoration and goodness from pain and loss, perhaps slightly similar to salvation secured by a humble yet brave queen for her people living in a terrible time of exile. Despite the successful endings of the stories of Esther and Dorothy, I suspect that both of them experienced the imposter syndrome that we may feel when fearful of what this time and place is calling us to do. And maybe, if we are not experiencing it, then we are not stepping out of our comfort zones into action. Yes, there is fear, and maybe even real danger in our response, and we are still searching for God's activity in the world at times when God does not appear to be present. Yet I think all of our heroines would tell you, God does not only call the equipped, but promises to equip the called. What are we called to do for just a time as this? How will we color our corner of the world? Fear not, let the Spirit lead, and together we will create a beautiful canvas of God's love and justice. All thanks be to God.